Rishus Bleich Shlita. I wanted to discuss today the topic of Hatzmada. Hatzmada is a very big deal in Hilchos Ribbis. It's called linkage. And you can't really talk about linkage without talking about the nature of coins, of matbeos, when it comes to Ribbis, which is itself a very complicated sugya, also because the nature of coins and currency has changed over time. That once upon a time the actual metal content in the coins was itself valuable, and even after it ceased to be valuable, it corresponded to some type of valuable stash of coins or gold or metal that existed somewhere else. And nowadays it doesn't really serve either of those purposes. It's just something which I think it's called fiat money. So I guess a good article on this, and it really is something that the government just decides they're going to give out a certain amount. It doesn't necessarily correspond to some stash of gold in Fort Knox or something like that. So the nature of coins has changed over time, and it's not only coins. A lot of our money is paper money. A lot of our money is imaginary money. Most transactions nowadays get performed without any coins or dollar bills being handed over. There's just some amorphous thing known as money, but the money certainly does correspond to some type of a mintage. In America we have dollars, and in Israel there's shkolim, and in Europe there are euros, and there are other types of coins in different places as well. And sometimes you have a coin which is more stable than other coins. Certainly the dollar has traditionally been viewed as a more stable form of currency than certain others, particularly at certain points in time, the shekel. The shekel was very precarious. When I was in Eretz Yisrael as a Talmud in the 1980s, boy was it precarious. There was what they called inflatia doheret. There was runaway, rampant inflation, and every single day the market would change and the shekel would be further devalued, and the only thing of stability would be money. And there's sometimes a desire or an implicit expectation when people conduct their transactions, whether they be loan transactions or whether they be commercial sale and purchase transactions, that the real determining currency that's going to characterize the amount of money that will ultimately be paid will be the more stable form of currency. So even if dollars weren't mentioned, maybe people had the expectation of dollars. So there's a discussion, can you explicitly say, well, I'm loaning you shkolim, but really it's based on whatever is the dollar value today, and it's the dollars that it's worth today that I expect you to pay me back. If you do that in Israel, is that considered to be okay or not? And even if you didn't say it, is it considered as if you've said it? Especially when you have inflatia doheret, when you have rampant runaway inflation. And the poskim spoke about this, particularly in the 1980s, when the shekel was so unstable. Nowadays, that the shekel has become much more stable, almost as stable as the dollar, so then the discussion has changed somewhat. Although many poskim still say that the dollar is, I don't know if I can use the word gold standard or whether that would be very confusing in this context, but the dollar is considered to be a very lofty standard even nowadays, just like the English language is a language recognized all over the world. The dollar is a currency recognized all over the world to some degree. Not completely and not always, and even in Israel today, it won't carry you as far as it used to carry you, and there'll be many places where if you give them a dollar, they'll look at you kind of funny and say, this is Israel, have you forgotten? We only take a shkolim over here. So I'll begin the discussion with the Gemara in Bava Metzia, Daf Mem Daled Amud Beis. It talks about how we have a certain calculation of how much is in a dinar shel zahav, that it would be the Isser, we say, dinar shel kesef, echad me'esrim achamisha b'dinar shel zahav, that if I had a dinar shel zahav, so that would be 25 dinarim of kesef. And the Gemara says, l'may nafkamina l'pinyan abein. For what purpose do I need to know that? For pinyan abein, we're trying to prove in the Gemara at this point in time that gold compared to silver is tiva, that would be the currency, and the silver compared to gold is like pera, it's like fruits, like apples and oranges, that it varies in terms of its own value, but the stable standard would be the gold standard, right? So yamis b'shlam etiva have, if I say that this is the gold is literally the gold standard, and that it's a yatziv omed, that it just stands in place, so I understand mishar tanim b'miti dekayetz. So I'm evaluating based on something itself which is not going to move. So that if over time I had the silver became worth more or worth less, so I can say, oh, maybe you have to pay more silver coins. But if I say that the gold itself is going to shift in value, so we're not going to measure and evaluate with respect to something that's going to go up and down, because then it may be that we'll say, oh, well, sometimes the gold is going to be worth less or more, and therefore you'll have to say, oh, now it's worth less. So the person gave 25 dinari kesef, and that was too much. So the Kohen's going to have to return some of the money. And sometimes it'll be worth more, and we'll say, oh, that you didn't give enough. Therefore, we say it must be that this remains stable, that this is a stable price. Shma mina tiva havi shma mina. And what we see from this Gemara is that whenever something is tiva, so if there's a change in the marketplace, so we don't attribute it to to whatever is the tiva, whatever is considered to be the legal tender. The legal tender is very stable. It could be that other things are going to go up and down in terms of their own value, but this is going to be legal tender, right? That's what it seems that's what the Gemara seems to be telling us. So the Chazon Ish says, and this is something which Rav Moshe Feinstein writes about. I don't have that in the sources in Yoreh, Chelik Beisim, and Kuf Yudalid. The Chazon Ish says that even if I know for a fact, and this is a source based in the materials, even though I know that the coin itself has become less valuable because, let's say, there was a lot more metal in the world. Let's say that it was a silver coin, and there's a lot more silver in the world, and maybe that's why the silver is not able to buy as much as it was able to buy before. I say, no, that's not what happened. What happened was that the fruit became more expensive. That's the way I'm going to attribute it, even though I know it's otherwise. Chazon Ish says that's the chiddush of the Gemara, that it's not dependent upon what the reality is. Once I classify something as tiva, that means it becomes the measuring rod with respect to everything else that goes on around it. It's a fixed amount. And he quotes from our Gemara, Daf Mem Dalet Amud Beis, and Perek Hazav and Baba Metzia, to Yukra Vizula, Misyaches Elapei Liolam Below Elamat Beah, that we always attribute to any changes to the commodities, to what we call the fruit, the items that are being purchased, the eggs and the apples and the oranges. Those are the things that go up and down in value. There's nothing to do with the coins. So even if everything, all the fruits, all of the commodities in the marketplace, not only the eggs, say everything is going up in terms of price. So I can't say, oh, it's because of some type of a chicken disease that is going around, that the eggs are more expensive. Everything is going up in price, and it must have something to do with the coins just not having as much buying power. I say nothing doing. It's all because of the fruits. Even though I know that it has nothing to do with the fruits, I say, yeah, there must be a fruit shortage or whatever, and that's why all the prices are going up. I know the reality is otherwise. Chazon Ish says it doesn't matter, but Moshe Feinstein says it doesn't matter either, that we consider this to be fixed in place. Certainly when it comes to loan transactions, we're not going to shift or adjust the amount that you pay back, that we say, oh, well, when the loan was extended, $10 was worth $10, and now $10 is worth what $8 was worth then, so you're going to have to pay more money. It doesn't matter. You may have taken out the loan 30 years ago, and maybe now a dollar only gets you half as far as it went then. We don't say you have to pay back double. You pay back exactly the same amount. But Moshe's main thrust of that tshuva is not really about loan transactions. That's thrown in derech agav. That tshuva is mostly about Ma'aseh Ksofim, where he says Ma'aseh Ksofim. It does have to do with how much the genuine worth of something is in terms of how much you're going to pay for Ma'aseh Ksofim. You sell a house, whatever. But when it comes to loans, says Rav Moshe, this is the approach that we follow, and this is lockstep in accordance with what's written by the Chazon Ish. So according to this, we would not pay back more money in the event of inflation. The Minchas Yitzchak has an extensive tshuva on this that I printed and I copied in full because it's worth reading, because he has a lot of different points, a lot of different gemaras that are germane to the topic that he cites and so forth. The Minchas Yitzchak rejects the opinion of the Ab Bezdin of Philadelphia at the time that he wrote the tshuva, who was Rav Yelis. So Rav Yelis was the Ab Bezdin of Philadelphia, and he was of the opinion that in the event of inflation, where it's quite clear that the adjustments in the prices from when the loan was made until the time that the loan is paid back is due to the devaluation of the actual currency, and not because fruit became more expensive or commodities became more expensive. So he says, so you have to, the borrower has to pay back more money. It's not considered to be ribbis. If he didn't pay back more money, it would be considered to be gezel, right? Because we have always these two different sides of the coin. You'll forgive all of these cliches that are hopelessly confusing in the context of this year. But the two sides of the coin are that either you have a ribbis problem or you have a gezel problem. If you're paying back too much, you have a ribbis problem. If you're paying that back too little, you have a gezel problem. So he said, I think in this case we would have a gezel problem. The person's going to repay the exact amount of money that was borrowed in terms of it being the exact amount denominationally of the bills that were borrowed. You have to look at the change in the cost of living index and the medid, as they say, and you make the adjustment accordingly when you're living in a time of inflation. We're always living in a time of inflation. I don't ever remember waking up and being told, oh, the dollar now is able to buy more than it was before because it's actually worth more than it was 20 years ago. That hasn't happened. Maybe once upon a time such a thing could happen. It doesn't happen with us. And therefore, he says you should make the adjustment. Minchas Yitzchak, as is the case with 99.9% of the poskim, disagrees very categorically with such an approach and says that if I'm only dealing with inflation, for sure, this is the halach of tiva versus pera. Tiva remains yatziv v'omed. It's strong and unchangeable, and therefore you pay back the same amount. Now, that is true. Certainly, when I have a monetary transaction, if I would have, let's say, a transaction where it wasn't money that was loaned out, but let's say that it was apples. So I know that we have a din d'Rabbanan. I can't lend you, this is discussed, Klotza b'sa'ah and Siman Kuf Samach Beis. I can't lend you 10 apples and you'll pay me back 10 apples, because maybe when you pay me back the 10 apples will be worth more. So we prohibited midrabanan. Midaraisa, I just look at Basar Meikara Islinan. I go after like the very first Gemara in Perek Ezu Neshach. I look at the very beginning of the transaction. It was 10 apples. I gave you 10 apples, you're giving me back 10 apples. But the thing is that apples do not have an objective value. They do change over time. So it could be that when you pay me back the 10 apples, maybe they were worth $10, $1 a piece when they were big apples, whatever. When I loaned you the 10 apples, and now they're worth $12. So that's a problem. If when you pay me back the apples, they were still worth $10, you can pay me back 10 apples. If they're worth $8, so you can pay me back the 10 apples. That would be okay. But if the apples are worth $12 at the time that the loan is completed, so then you have to pay me back whatever was the monetary value of the apples at the time of the loan, which was $10, but you don't pay me back the 10 apples at that point in time. That's the halacha. However, the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah. The Mishnah says explicitly that there's an exception to the rule if aso domim. If at the time in which I gave you the 10 apples, I said, these are 10 apples. But really, what I'm loaning you is not the 10 apples per se. What I'm loaning you is the value of 10 apples, which is $10. So you should pay me back $10 because, in fact, that is what 10 apples were worth at the time. So if I link it, that's called hatzmada. I link it to the currency in the marketplace. That's called yasenu damim. So the Mishnah says it's what the Shulchan Aruch paskin siman kuf samach beis amid aleph. If yasenu damim, I'm oseh the commodity into money. I simply recharacterize it according to its monetary worth. So that's what you'll pay me back. You'll pay me back the $10. And this way, I'm protected in the event that the value of 10 apples will go down to $8. So then you don't have the right anymore to only pay me the eight. You don't have the right to pay me the 10 apples and get away with an $8 repayment. You'd have to pay me actually $10. Question under those circumstances. Whether you can get away with, I gave you 10 apples and now you're going to give me 12 apples because that's the value of it. That's a shaila. But certainly with respect to giving me back the monetary value, if I linked it, so then that would be okay. But I can only link to money. I can't give you money and say I'm going to link the money to the apples. That today I'm lending you $10. And I know that $10 is worth 10 apples. So whenever you pay me back the $10, you have to pay me back whatever amount of money is going to buy me 10 apples. So if it takes $20, because you're going to pay me back 20 years from now, and by then the prices will have doubled, and it's going to cost $20 to buy 10 apples, so you'll pay me back $20, okay, at that point in time. Because then I'm linking to payros, I'm linking to apples, and that I'm not allowed to do. That's what the Meiri says, pretty much mefurish. It's really more by his terminology that he uses, that he says that even though it's viewed ki'ilu, that when I'm giving somebody money, he says it's ki'ilu, I'm giving them the money for the purpose of buying the payros, but that doesn't mean that you have the right to calculate the repayment based on the amount of payros that you would be able to, the exact same amount of payros that I would be able to purchase at the time of the repayment. He says, no, that doesn't work. That's what the Gemara is talking about when it says that if I have a transaction in which I am loaning you 100 prutos, and I say you have to pay me back 120 prutos, and that's a tiva, even though at the time of the loan, the 100 prutos is worth a danka, a sixth of a gold coin, and at the time of the repayment, 120 prutos is worth the same danka. Since the danka is considered to be payros, so you can't link to the payros. He says, even though the Gemara doesn't say there's an explicit hasmada to the payros, he writes it's kilu. There was an explicit linkage to the payros. He says that is not hasmada, that's called ribbis. That's called ribbis. Hatzmada is because fundamentally we view a transaction as really as something which, whenever there's a loan transaction, the main focus is on the money, unless you said otherwise. So therefore, if you say that the main focus is on the money, of course you have the right to be paid back the value of the money that you're essentially lending, whether it's in the form of money or whether it's in the form of payros at the time of the transaction. But otherwise, it doesn't really work. So therefore, hatzmada is not going to work to protect you from inflation when you have basically one currency, like dollars, and you're making a loan in dollars, and you just want it to be indexed to the cost of living, that whatever you or I are able to purchase with these dollars today, I should be able to purchase when you pay me back, so therefore you'll pay me back more money. No, that's called ribbis. That kind of hatzmada is not going to work. So hatzmada is only going to get you so far. Hatzmada works when you're linking to currency. It doesn't work when you link it to payros.
In currency of another country, that's payros too, right?
Currency of another country is a rashba. The Beis Yosef quotes a rashba, says explicitly that's payros, currency of another country. Now, of course, That's why you have contemporary poskim to complicate things a little bit, to say that's why we talk a little bit at the beginning of the shiur about how currency today is not what currency was in yesteryear. When currency stood for the currency being worth something in its own right, it had a certain metallic content, and that would be worth something independently. So then it made sense to say that if it's not my currency, so it's just some payros, it's some other commodity, something that has value for some other reason. I'm going to treat it like payros, when essentially the money is Muksa Machmas Gufo, that it doesn't have any value or purpose whatsoever other than the buying power that we're assigning to it. So Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has a shita in which he says that it doesn't matter where the currency is. The currency could be here in America, it could be in Israel, it could be in Europe, it could be in Antarctica. It doesn't matter. If it's just basically worthless currency that only means something based on its buying power, so you could do hatzmad in any currency. That's what Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. But he has a lot of shitos. Comes to Hilchos Ribbis that are very original. It's a very original shita. I don't think that that's a mainstream shita, but it makes sense if we're trying to figure out how maybe the nature of a currency changed. But that's a part of this discussion that's taking place between the Minchas Yitzchak and Rav Yalis. The machlokes turns in part on the sugya in Baba Kama Daf Tzadi Zayin, talking about Matbeah Shenifsala, right? That a person makes a loan, and then the Matbeah becomes nifsal. Why does it become nifsal? It becomes invalidated. It becomes invalidated by the Medina. So we say that even though it becomes invalidated, it's a whole machlokes. First of all, you have three sugyas, really back to back in Daf Tzadi Zayin. That's in the materials. It doesn't make it to the materials until a little bit later. On the very bottom of page 5, you have the reference to Daf Tzadi Zayin, and you have first of all a machlokes Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda with respect to a theft case. The machlokes starts off not with a habal case, but with a theft case. That if you have a case where you have a matbeah that was nifsal, Rav Huna says that nifsal, it does not have the din of nistak. It's not considered to be like it's completely out of commission, but rather it just means that it's invalidated in this Medina, but maybe it would be good, the coin would be good in a different Medina. And therefore, that's so that Rav Huna says that the nifsal is considered to be the same as nistak. And Rav Yehuda, he says nifsal is pesalto malchus. Rav Yehuda says pesalto malchus is also considered to be nistak if it's made no good altogether. So the machlokes is if it's made no good altogether. Then Rav Yehuda has the following shita, which he says lehekidami nifsal, says shepasalto medina zu v'yotza b'medina acheres. That this Medina says, the government says that it's no good, but it is going to be good somewhere. It is going to be good somewhere else. Now, if I say if I say like the shita of Rav Huna, it's going to end up that if I have a situation where it was made completely a puzzle somewhere else, so I'm going to. This is the shita, I think, of Rashi and Tosfos that say that we would paskin, or at least Tosfos says we paskin like Rav Huna, I think, that it ends up that you will be able to simply say, even though something is completely puzzle, I don't have to pay more than whatever the item was originally, than the original item. So if we take that, we have a machlokes within that shita between Rav and Shmuel, which is it mahamavis chaveil hamatbeah v'nifsla hamatbeah. If you had a loan transaction and then the matbeah, the coin became invalidated by the malchus, Rav Aman Hosein lo matbeah yotze be'osasha. Rav says that you give the new coin. You have to, since the old coin is not worth anything, so you have to pay in the new coin. Shmuel says no, as long as the old coin still has some type of circulation in a different country, so then you can say, the borrower can say to the lender, I'm paying you back the old coin. You can't use it in this Medina, so what? You'll use it in a different Medina. Go travel to a different Medina. So if Nachman then says, that's only if the lender has a way in which he could travel to this other country. If he didn't have a way of traveling, then no. So that's the basic sugya, and there's a machlokes Rishonim within the shita of Shmuel. Does it apply only when there, let's say there was a tanai that was made, a tanai that you're going to pay with mos hayotzin, with money that's going to be legal tender. But sometimes in the olden days, people would borrow matbeos, and the matbeos were worth something in their own right. So if there were something in their own right, so then the shita of Tosfos, based on Rashi, is that the borrower would have the right to say to the lender, you didn't stipulate that you wanted to get repaid in legal tender, so I'm just going to pay you the old matbeah, even though there's ein orcha l'meisel l'meishon. Even though it's not going to, you're not going to have any use of this coin anywhere in the world, even though it's going to be completely valueless to the lender, since the lender didn't make a tanai mefurish. This is all spelled out in Siman Ayin Dalin and Choshim Mishpat, right? That the borrower will be able to repay it unless there's a tanai mefurish. So then you have a whole sub discussion regarding, let's say that the matbeah itself wasn't invalidated, the matbeah was devalued. The matbeah that the Malchus said that we're just going to make it worth less money. So is that considered to be the same halacha? Here, the Ramah paskins like Tosfos, even though the Machaber paskins like the Rambam, that whenever there is that you need for the coin to still have some sort of utility in order for the borrower to pay it back, the halacha, like for us Ashkenazim, is like the Ramah, that it's only in the case where there was a tanai that was made that it has to have utility, but otherwise the borrower is able to pay back the old coin even though it was invalidated entirely. That's how the Ramah paskins in Siman Ayin Daled. But otherwise he can repay him, the borrower can repay the old invalidated coin. However, then he throws in a little bit of a twist. He says, but if there was a tanai, so then then the borrower has to pay legal tender. And it sounds like that if there was a tanai, then the borrower has to repay whatever is good legal tender. It sounds like there we're going to say, even if it's not good legal tender here, but it's good legal tender in Meishan, and the lender could travel to Meishan, we're not going to require that. But we're going to say to the borrower, if it's not good legal tender in the Medina where you borrow the money, so then you have to pay back what's good in this Medina, the new coin. That's Mos HaYotze. So it gets a little bit complicated, but that's the beginning part of the discussion. There's a third sugya. The third sugya is the sugya where Rava asks Rav Chisda. He says, what if it's not a question that the money was pasoled, that the coinage was pasoled altogether, but rather hosifu al hamatbeah. This I don't have in the Mara Mekomos. It's quoted in the long Maharshdam, so you can find it there, but it's not in the actual Mara Mekomos. So Rava said, what if the hosifu alav mahu? What if the government now you had a coin that was worth 4 ounces? And now they made it weightier. So if the borrower pays back the same coin, he's paying back more metal. So therefore, is that considered to be ribis? So he says, well, it depends. If they added a little bit to the measure of the metal, and that caused all of the prices out in the marketplace to change, so now it's going to be that you could buy more payros because of the fact that they added more metal. To this coin, and it had an effect on the price of the payros in the marketplace. So then we say that in such a case, the borrower doesn't have to pay back as much. If he would pay back too much, it would be, if he would pay back the same amount of coins, since he's adding extra metal, and it has an effect on the buying power of the coins, that he'll be able to, that you can buy more with it. So therefore, that's going to be ribbis, even though he's paying back the same amount of coins. So therefore, he pays less. So then the question becomes, well, what if they didn't? And if it has no effect on the payroll, so then we say it makes no difference ad chomesh. Ad chomesh, we're going to leave it alone. But once it becomes chomesh, that they added a fifth ounce of coin. This was a coin that was worth 4 ounces, weighed 4 ounces. Now it's going to be 5 ounces. So then we're going to apply the same principle that he doesn't pay back the same coin, because it's going to be ribbis, even though it had no effect on the payros in the marketplace. Why do we care about the 1/5? Because we could say maybe up until, it's a three-way machlokus in the Rishonim. One is that the Rosh says that the value of the extra metal is only when you melt it down, and you only, and it costs up to 1/5 to melt it down, so therefore there would be no value that you get in melting it down until it's going to be more than a fifth. It's to be more than a fifth. Second shita is that the Rashba says that there's an implied mechila. There's an implied mechila to up to 1/5. And the Mordechai says that what do you think, that every single coin has exactly the same weight? They weren't, didn't have such perfectly calibrated mints in those days that everything came out exactly the same. There was always up to a 1/5 variation anyway. It only becomes significant when it goes beyond that standard deviation of more than 1/5. Most Rishonim, with the exception of the Ravid, maybe Rashi, most of the Rishonim are of the opinion that just like Hosifu, we would have these distinctions and gradations. We would also have these gradations in the case of Pichsu, where the government decided that they're going to cut down on the amount of metal that's in the coin, where if that's going to have an effect on the marketplace, so then it's going to redound to the detriment of the lender, and then we're going to require the borrower to pay more to compensate, and certainly if it's going to be more than 1/5 of cutting down, he's going to have to pay more as well. So if you take this into consideration, so then you have to think about what's going on when you have an inflation situation. When I have an inflation situation, I don't have a Pasalto Malchus situation, right? Because they didn't invalidate anything per se. But the Minchas Yitzchak uses a very interesting argument to disagree with Rav Yalis, and he says as follows. He says that since we're dealing with a case where all the dollars and the money that we're dealing with in the case of inflation, everything is still extant, right? Everything is still extant. So everything is still around. It's just not worth as much. So he says at the very least, we can agree that we have the shita of Shmuel that we paskin like, Rav Nachman Aliba the Shmuel, the Islay Orcha Lemeshon, that you can pay in the old currency, the old amount, certainly, if there is the ability of the lender to go to Meshon. So he says this is no worse than Yesh Lo Derech Lemeshon. Yesh Lo Derech Lemeshon also, it's going to cost him some money to get on the plane to go to Meshon. So the things aren't going to be worth exactly the same. He's going to have to take a little bit of a hit. So this type of situation where I have inflation is no worse than Yesh Lo Derech Lemeshon, and therefore you could pay in the old currency whatever was the old value. And now the question is, why does he throw in this idea of Yesh Lo Derech Lemeshon, Leches Lemeshon? So this is he gets this from the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer had a similar machlokes with respect to himself and Mordechai Bennett. This was a case where the government had actually devalued money. And Rav Mordechai Bennett said that because of the fact that there was a devaluation of the money, therefore the amount that a borrower would have to repay should be based upon calibrating what was the value not the exact amount, but what was the value at the time of the loan, and he compared it to this whole sugya, and the Chassam Sofer said, no, nothing doing. This is like yesh lo derech lemeshon. So says the Minchas Yitzchak, why do I need yesh lo derech lemeshon? So says the Minchas Yitzchak, because you might have otherwise argued, and this really is very much the argument of everybody who wants to say, like Rav Yelis and like Rav Mordechai Bennett, and the truth of the matter is that the original proponent of this shita, and the main one, who caused all the trouble, or maybe proposed all of the solutions, depending on how you look at it, was the Maharsh Dam, going back 450 years ago, who started to argue according to these gradations, and he blames it on a Tosfos, and maybe even on a Gemara. But it started with the Maharsh Dam. So Minchas Yitzchak says, you might have thought that it's as if we have this distinction. Let's work within the Ramah, right? We have this distinction that it makes a difference as to whether you pay when in the case of nifsal. In the case of nifsal, it makes a difference in terms of whether you pay like the old currency that was nifsal or the new currency. Did you make a tanai? Did you not make a tanai? So he says you might make the argument that it's considered as if you made a tanai. So since it's considered as if you made a tanai, therefore I need this argument of yesh lo derech, that this is no worse than yesh lo derech leilech lemeshon. Because if there was no tanai, so the argument stops right there. Of course you could pay with respect to the old currency, because that's how we paskin in the Ramah. The Ramah paskins like Tosfos, that if there was no tanai, so you could pay with respect to what was pasoled. The currency that was pasoled. You're just giving basically sticks and stones that are worthless, except in those days they weren't completely worthless. So therefore you'll say that certainly nowadays that the coinage doesn't really have any intrinsic value in its own right. So of course, whenever there's a loan, it's as if you made some sort of a tanai that this is how it should be. This is how it should be repaid. There's even a Shulti Gibarim that says, Bisman Hazeh. It's always understood people are looking to get paid back in the actual the actual monetary value, not the matbeos themselves. So you want to make that argument. So therefore, I'm telling you that this is no worse than yesh lo derech lemeshon. Now, of course, because of the fact that this sugya is so pikayun, so Minchas Yitzchak, very thorough, posek, Baruch Hashem. So he points out, but the truth is that the next line in the Ramah that we read in Siman Ayin Daled, that quoted from the Mordechai, indicates that if there is an explicit tanai, so then I don't care if there's the derech leilech lemishon, if the coin has been invalidated in the place where it was extended. So of course you would have to pay back in the new currency. So what does it help me to say lo gara from the case of yesh lo derech lemeshon? So here he says something which is a little bit of a mind bender. He says, no, the reason why the Chassam Sofer threw that in was because there's a tanai. You can say that to pay with respect to pay a matbeya, right? That's what, like the Ramah says, so maybe you could say that there's like a tanai that he's going to pay money, but nonetheless we don't have what would be a mefurish tanai that is as if the person said that he's going to be paying the value of the money. It would be more akin to making a tanai to pay most stam, as opposed to paying most that would be the value. I don't really understand that distinction, because the Ramah says that as long as there's a tanai litein lo mos, that he says hitnen litein lo mos hayotzin behotza. So he says if he made a tanai litein lo mos hayotzin behotza chay litein lo mos hayotze. So here what the Chassam Sofer is doing is sort of nitpicking. He's saying that he's giving in a little bit to the argument of a Mordechai Bennett to say it's like there's a tanai in this case, but only a tanai litein lo mos. But you can't say that he made a tanai litein lo mos hayotzin behotza. So litein lo mos, I'm still going to need the argument of that at the very least in order to get away with the borrower paying the old currency, or the currency before it was devalued, but he's still going to be paying the same amount. So you still need the argument that yesh lo derech lahotzi b'meishan, and he says that you still have that argument because since it's still the same currency, lo gara, from yesh lo derech lahotzi b'meishan, it's just worth a little bit less, like that case. And then he makes a separate argument, which I think is the more compelling argument, I don't know, more compelling argument, but the more essential argument. And that argument is that Eino Dome, the two different cases, because in the case over here, we're dealing with where it was Nifsal HaMatbea, but here it's just worth less. We don't have a case in the Gemara that says that when the money is simply worth less, where it wasn't Nifsal, that you're going to get to pay an adjustment. What about the sugya, the third sugya, that we quoted, the Bay Minei Ravim Rachista sugya of Hotzosifu Ala Matbea or Piksu Ala Matbea? There was an actual physical change in the Matbea. Here we're not talking about an actual physical change in the Matbea, so therefore the Chassam Sofer sticks to his guns, and the Minchas Yitzchak sticks to his guns. And this was the same type of exchange, really, that existed between the Maharshdam and the Machanei Ephraim, going back to the original iteration of this machlokes. Now, the thing that's common in the case of the Maharshdam and the case of the Chassam Sofer is that it seemed that there was a government devaluation. Government devaluation, you could say, at least that's more in the territory of Nifsal. When I'm dealing with inflation, it's not even in the category of Nifsal or Malchus, because Malchus didn't do anything. It's just the circumstances of the marketplace caused there to be a devaluation of the currency. You could say for that for sure. I have no precedent in the sources to say that there would be a requirement to pay more money. But if the Malchus was involved, so maybe I could begin to have an argument, and I could just say that no, it's not nifsal if the money is still extant, the currency is still extant, it's just worth less, or if even if it was an official devaluation of the country, you say it's like Piksu Ala Matbea, it's not Piksu Ala Matbea because they didn't change the actual coinage of the coin, and therefore it doesn't fall into that category. But the case in the Maharshdam is interesting. There's a long essay take your question in a second, just want to finish the sentence. There's a long essay by the Mechaber of the Nesiva Shalom. Nesiva Shalom, his author is Shalom Yosef Gelber. He has a beautiful simon. There we have it in the bookcase, wonderful. Simon Kuf Samachay, he tells you everything you need to know about the subject. And he tells you that if you look closely at the Maharshdam's case was where there was a devaluation of the coin by the government, but Maharshdam tells you explicitly, that makes my case stronger in terms of my argument that you would only have to pay, or not you only have to pay, that you have to pay in accordance with the original value, and therefore extra money is going to have to be added in this case. But the Maharshdam seems to say that makes my argument stronger. But not that he's depending upon the argument. The Maharshdam seems to say even if, in its own right, we know for a fact that it was the tiva that changed in terms of its value, and it wasn't the payro, it wasn't the forces of the marketplace in terms of the payros being more scarce or more abundant that caused the change in the prices, but rather it was the tiva, it was because the coin itself has become undervalued. So he says that he believes that he has clear proofs from the Gemara and from Tosfos, that in such a case you would add on to the amount of repayments. And the Maharshdam really arguably could be talking about the effects of inflation, which is why his approach and his rayos and how we deal with his rayos are so going to be so important. Halacha l'maaseh. Yes, Dr. Cooper. I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
No, I just I hope I'm not opening can of worms here, but I mean this seriously. I understand the conceptual distinction you're making between the Medina and Malchus versus market forces, but what about what's going on right now? There are comments saying that President Trump, by pushing tariffs that are coming from the government, it's going to be have such a volatile effect on the market that sometimes government manipulations do affect the market that much. Maybe one of the distinctions is not as clear as we've just said.
100%. Meaning that if you would have certain regulations that are promulgated by the government that is going to have an effect on the value of the currency in the marketplace, you can argue that that is akin to Pasalto Malchus. You could argue that way. It's more when it's more amorphous, that you can't necessarily pin it on a particular regulation that you can more easily distinguish between the cases. But I think that you would have an argument. Would it be a slam dunk, obvious argument? It would depend. You might say that I have to take a look and see whether it's really had an effect with respect to the value of like all the coins in the marketplace. Maybe it only has an effect on international transactions and not local transactions, in which case maybe it wouldn't make a difference. And the poskim talk about these fine-tuned distinctions, some a little bit more and some a little bit less, but it's touched upon in the discussions in the poskim. So what were the two rayos that the Maharshtam had? Maharshtam had this case where basically there was a loan of Gerusos, that there was a Grushosh, so that there was, at the time of the loan, the Grushosh was worth a certain amount of coins that was called Levonim, but this doesn't seem to be necessarily the focus of his tshuva. That's another thing you could say to distinguish his tshuva. Maybe there were two different coins, and we're saying one compared to the other was Pera, and the other was considered to be Tiva, but that doesn't seem to be the way that he's framing his argument. He seems to be saying that I had Grushosh, that they were the Tiva. Grushosh, he says, is considered to be the Tiva, and they were worth a certain amount at the time of the loan, and then over time they became worth less, so therefore he says at the time of repayment, a person should have to pay more grushoshim. That's basically the argument of the Maharshtam, and that has to do because of the fact that there was a government promulgation which devalued the grushim, the grushoshim between the time of the loan and the time of the repayment. Right? Okay. So now, yes. I'm sorry.
Increase the value of the grushos. So now you only have to pay 40. They're worth more. So you have to pay.
No, he was saying that at the end of the day, he was saying that you have to say like this. The Maharshtam says like this. He says, Yatzad Dvar Melech, Shlo Yeh Shum Adam Ashai Lepurim Lekablam, Yoseh Mimem Levanim Grushos. That originally that they were worth 101.
No, that was the sale of the
thing. That's right. They're worth
50.
They're worth 50, and now they're worth 40.
So the
Hold on.
went down, the Levina went up. Which way do you look at it? But either way.
Hold on. I'll tell you exactly. All right, we'll get to those details. The point of the matter is the case of the Maharshtam was that the lender was claiming it was a sale transaction, but it was a sale transaction. But he was claiming that the amount that was originally supposed to be paid to him now had to be increased because of the fact that there was a change in the value in the marketplace. So because of the change in the value in the marketplace, right? Because it had been devalued. So right.
It was devalued.
Correct. That's correct. The Grushosh was devalued because it was devalued, so therefore he should be paid more. It's the Pixel case. Well, whatever I said, I apologize. Because it was devalued, therefore he should be paid more. Thank you very much. So therefore, he says that he believes that when you do have such a devaluation, obviously we're talking about a devaluation. If it's in the other direction, so there's a question of paying less, not paying more. Thank you. So the Maharshtam says that I have the Gemara in Baba Kama Daf Tzadi Zayin about Hosifu ala Matbeah. So he says that we have this distinction between, and we say what's true in the case of Hosifu ala Matbeah is true with respect to Piksu ala Matbeah for everybody except for the Ravid. So that's how we paskin. We paskin that way in Shulchan Aruch. It's explicitly paskin. If you have Piksu ala Matbeah, and in fact that is that's our siman. So even in a case of Piksu ala Matbeah that we have in Siman Kuf Samachay, the person's going to have to end up paying more. So he says that this is essentially the same thing. How do I know it's the same thing? Even though there was no change that was made to the actual currency. So he says the reason I know that it's exactly the same thing is because why do I distinguish between if it's more than a fifth, and that is the coinage or the amount of the weight of the coinage is changed more than a fifth, or in one to make it heavier, or more than a fifth to make it lighter, then the person will either have to, the borrower either pays less in the case where it's Hosifu Yosem Michomish, or pays more when it was Pixu Yosem Michomish. Why is that? So he says because that's sort of an objective standard, right? Why is it then that if it's less than a chomish, if I see that the marketplace prices have been affected, then the person still has to pay a different amount. So that we're still going to say that the case of Hosifu, the borrower will pay less. In the case of Pixu, the borrower is going to pay more. He says because in that particular case, even though I don't care about the change to the coinage, because I only really care about the change to the coinage when it's more than a chomish, the fact that I changed it a little bit, and I see that there were market forces that were affected as a result, causes me to say that it was the tibba that was responsible. Since it was the tibba that was responsible, not the payer that was responsible, so then the borrower has to pay more. So we see it's not just about making a change to the weight of the currency. It's about knowing for a fact that the changes in the marketplace were brought about by the tibba. So if I know that the change in the marketplace was brought about because there was a change made to the tibba, and I see that the value of what you can buy is going to be different in the marketplace because it was devalued, right? So then it says the Maharaj-Dam that we have a clear proof that the borrower should have to pay more. That's proof number one. Simply from the Sugya and Daf Tzadi Zayin base going on to Tzadi Chesam and up. Then, the proof number two is the Tosfos on Mem Dalet and base. Tosfos on Daf Mem Dalet and base talks about a sale transaction where he says that we have differences when it comes to Mekach Memker, our original Gemara, that we have to know what is the corresponding value of dinarim zav to dinari kesef and so forth. So he says, L'kachan nearest the top of page 9, the farishim machal lo chepes b'chupta al isarin. I have a seller that sold an object in 24 isarin, kishahayu chupta al b'dinar, which was 1 gold dinar, v'chakak zol v'hayu lamid beis b'dinar, and then before payment was rendered, it became devalued, and now you need 32 dinarim of kesef in order for it to equal the value of 1 dinar of zahav. And so the buyer can no longer get away with paying 24 isarin, and to say, oh, is the dinar that simply went up in value? The isarin amdu bimkoman, and the isar is exactly the same. We say no. Dinar kesef, he has to give the dinar kesef. I'm sorry, it's 24, I guess, isarin, which are silver that add up to a dinar of kesef. So he says no, it's the dinar of kesef, which is the tibba, olam beis isarin, and so he has to either give the dinar of kesef or he has to give 32 isarin. So the way in which the Maharaj-Dam learns this Tosfos is that the 24 isarin that are going into a dinar of kesef are themselves considered to be dinar, a tibba. And despite the fact that they themselves are considered to be tibba, nonetheless, you have to pay an extra amount, a premium, because of the market forces which showed that the tibba itself became devalued in the interim, and since the tibba itself became devalued in the interim, therefore you have to pay extra tibba. So these were his two different rayos. Now, he had many who disagreed with him based and said that the rayos are not good rayos. Machane Ephraim in particular, was so he rebutted both of these rayos. First of all, the Gemara in Baba Kama Daf Tzadi Zayin deals with a change, as we said, to the weight of the metal. He wants to argue, we see when the change is only a little bit, we already have caused a reduction, in the amount that the borrower would have to pay, or an increase in the amount the borrower would have to pay. That's nice. But there was still some sort of a change in the metal. I don't have a precedent from the Gemara that when there's no change in the metal, that I'm going to require more to be paid in exchange. So therefore, he says, the Maisa, that's not the Metzius. And then what does the Maharaj-Dam do with the sugya that we started out with in Baba Metzia? And Daf Mem Dalet, it says that the tibba is considered to always be yatziv omeid. How is he going to explain that? Even Tosfos says that very strongly in the sugya on Daf Tzadi Zayin. So I would have a stira between the two Tosfos according to the Maharaj-Dam. The Maharaj-Dam would simply say very clearly that, yes, when I have a suffix as to whether the changes in the market force came from the payros or whether it came from the tibba, I attribute it to the payros. But if I know for a fact that it came from a tiva, so then you add to the tiva. That's what he says. The Maharshtam has an answer for this, but that's the rebuttal number one. What about the Tosfos? Tosfos seems very, very clear. The Chazon Ish, Yoreh Deah, the Siman Ayin Daled, the Sifkat and Ches, says, the second paragraph, says that in the case of the Tosfos, it's very clear, since I need to be able to be miyashiv, what would clearly otherwise be a contradiction between Tosfos and Baba Kama, Daf Tzadi Zayin, and this Tosfos and Baba Metzia. So the answer is that the dinarin were pera. In his case, the dinar kesef that remained yetziv for omed, where you pay the dinar kesef or you pay the lamed beis isarin, the isarin were pera, and the dinar kesef was tiva. So pera can change over time. So what was the 24 isarin are like 24 eggs. 24 eggs were worth the dinar kesef at the time of they stipulated for the sale, and then at the time for the payment, so 32 eggs were worth a dinar of kesef. So that's why the Tosfos is saying you want to pay in eggs, so you're going to have to pay 32 eggs. You want to pay money, so fine. You could have paid a dinar kesef to begin with, and you could pay a dinar kesef now. So there's now the Chavos Yair says something very interesting. He says that the way we can understand that Tosfos is, I told you this concept of Hatzmada. I only brought you a raya in one direction from a Meiri at the beginning of the Perek Ezu Neshek to say that you can't have Hatzmada to Peiros. Did I bring you a raya that I could have Hatzmada to money? I didn't bring you a raya. So it says I brought you the case of Sa'ah b'Sa'ah. I said that was a Mishnah. Okay, fine. Mishnah is not a bear raya. But he says that I have another. But I have here a raya for something better than that. Sa'ah b'Sa'ah is apples to money. Apples to money. I brought you a raya. I didn't bring you a raya that from shekel to shkalim to dollars. That I didn't bring a raya for. Shkalim to dollars, I have one thing which is legal tender, I have another thing which is legal tender. So he says there's such a thing that I can have two things which are legal tender within the same system. So he says that was the case of Hatzmada. Yes, it's true. The 24 Yisurin, says the Chavos Das, 100%, that was Tiva. But when the sale was made based on 24 Yisurin, the 24 Yisurin were linked to the dinar kesef. Since they were linked to the dinar kesef, which was also a strong tiva, so he says that you can link to another strong tiva, and that's considered to be perfectly legitimate. He has this in the Chavos Yair at the beginning. Did I say Chavos Yair? I'm so sorry. Chavos Das. He has it the Chavos Das at the beginning of Siman Kuf Samachay, and he has this in his Perush on the Shulchan Aruch and the Sivas HaMishpah and the Siman Ayin Daled Sifkat and Hey, has the same idea that we see that you have the ability to do Hatzmada from one coin which is Tiva to another Tiva which is also a strong Tiva, and that's basically what was going on over here. So this creates the precedent for doing a Hatzmada within Eretz Yisrael from shkalim to dollars, where I could have two different things that both serve as Tiva. And then he gives another answer as well.
That's the argument against the Maharsham. Maharshach, in his two chuvas against the Maharsham, makes this argument against the Maharsham that it's always that two currencies never have a problem of Hatzmada.
Yeah, you could argue that whenever I have two currencies, one is going to be tiv and one is going to be payra by definition, right? You could say, but this is a stronger argument. This is saying that they could both be tiv. But Maharsham was using this as he was claiming there wasn't a hatzmada per se. It's just that there was a devaluation of the tiva, and therefore you have to pay extra. That was the Maharsham's argument. He wasn't focusing on the fact that there was a different coin that was involved per se. Like that would be the determining factor. Okay. And then you have a third answer that he seems to give, which is that you can draw a distinction between a case of mecher and a case of halva. That the case of halva, so there you can never say that you pay extra based on devaluation. But if it's a case of mecher, so you could say you could pay extra because otherwise you would have an ona'ah problem. The Nesiv Shalom seems to view those two things as two different answers. In the Machnei Ephraim, one that there's a distinction between mecher and halva, and one that his case was a case of ona'ah. But if you read the Machnei Ephraim, it seems to me that they're one and the same answer. So that's another important answer as well, because that leads to some contemporary poskim to say, while we don't buy the Maharshtam's argument completely, Maybe if I'm not dealing with a halva situation, but I'm dealing with a mecher situation, so then maybe then I could be a little bit more inclined to accept the argument of the Maharshtam, because that could be a potential interpretation of Tosfos, that if it's a mecher situation, so then we would deal with the possibility that based on a devaluation, we would require for there to be a higher payment. Like, for example, in the case of, what's the most common case where this comes up in Piskei Din in Eretz Yisrael nowadays? The most common case? The ksuva. The ksuva. Now these old ksuvas, these couples that get married, get divorced after 50, 60 years of marriage, and you pull out the ksuva. The wife wants to collect the ksuva. She's entitled to 100,000 liros. 100,000 liros nowadays is probably not going to even get you onto the light rail. Okay, it's 100,000 liros does not get you far at all. Bisman is there. You basically it's worth 10 shkolim chadashim. Okay, maybe you have a couple of rides on the light rail, but beyond that, you're not going to get too much more. And this becomes a major focal point. We'll get to some of the tshuvos in a moment regarding the ksuva case.
Why did he focus on the Maharshtam? Everyone disagreed with him in his door and after his door. Why?
Not everybody. We see that not everybody, because certainly these variation cases of Mordechai Bennett and Rav Yalis and these correspondences continue Ada Yom Hazeh, and therefore it's not the Maharshtam has never really been completely discounted, to use another confusing term for purposes of this discussion. So I wouldn't say that. Now, again, the Maharshtam, in terms of his most extreme case, remember, that case for sure has not really gained traction, namely when the government had no involvement. Because in his case, the government did have involvement, but he seemed to say that even if the government wouldn't have had involvement, I would say exactly the same thing that I'm saying now. If you take a look on page 8, he says, I'll just read the main line. He says, Asher ein safek, this is the third paragraph, Asher ein safek shkol ben das Yoreh. You always have to be worried when somebody speaks like very authoritatively about the correctness of their view, and there's no question whatsoever that I'm correct, so you have to wonder. Doesn't matter, it's a sale transaction, loan transaction. Roy lives so kain halacha shekol mi shechayv liken chaver ben memekak mein melva mei grushish או קוף סהובים שעתה בשעס הפירון יפרה כל כך סהובים על כל כך גרושה שיושבים הקוף שבשעה הראשונה. It has to be worth whatever these coins were worth at the time of the original loan, the time the original purchase took place. V'gam, and then he throws in v'gam. V'gam chavana zochel tov. V'gam ki b'nidon shelefanenu lo hayinu tzrichem l'chol ma shekasavnu. And also, we didn't even need the whole analysis. Ki adava pasha me'aso shkimin shpirish b'vut patas kof alaf levanim al nisnim sag she'shalom kol kach grusha she'alu kof alaf b'lebeis. Says since the government basically had made this enactment itself, so therefore obviously we would follow what they had put into place. What's very interesting is that his original, so he seems to throw that in as an extra consideration. What's interesting is that his original tshuva only relied on that sugya of the Gemara regarding Hosifa al Mabeya or Pixel al Mabeya. That's the whole thing. And then he writes afterwards the raya that he brought from Tosos, which is a much more powerful raya. The Chaburah. He writes, Acha Yamin Balamdi Bi Yeshiva Parak Azar. You see, Dibor Katan, the Gemara, the tiny. I saw this tiny Dibor Katan in the Tosos on the Gemara. About the 24 Isurim that you have to repay in 32 Isurim, and then he throws that in as his additional raya. But he writes, Acha Yam V'lamdi B'Yeshiva, which I think is very, very beautiful, just as Musa Haskell, you have this giant posek writing this important Shuvas for Klal Yisrael, still sitting and learning in Yeshiva, and from what he's picking up, this little Tosfos that he's picking up when he's learning this parak of Azav in the Yeshiva, so that becomes, an important part of the continuation of the Tshuva, just an interesting, sidelight. So now, again, the Maharshtam's major, chiddush is even if I didn't have a devaluation, the Chassam Sofer is talking about a case if I did have a devaluation. So the question simply is, in the case of a devaluation, where what used to be worth $3, okay, is now worth only $2, right? That let's say that 3 shkolim yesterday could have purchased 3 apples. Now those same 3 shkolim can purchase. Let's say that the same 3 shkolim has greater power, greater purchase power. It now can buy 4.5 apples. So you would only have to pay, according to the case of Hosifu ala Mabea, if I would treat devaluation or a greater valuation the same as the Hosifu ala Mabea case, then the bar would only have to pay back $2, right? And if we would apply this principle, even in a case of where the value is being changed by the government, right? And in the Piksu case, the equivalent would be if now you can only buy 2 apples with $3, so the bar would have to pay back $4.50, right? So the question is, what if I knew for a fact, like the Maharshdam was arguing, I knew for a fact that the change in the value really had to do with the coin because of the fact that this was a decree by the government. So what should be the din? So the Chavis Das says it doesn't make a difference. That's what he says. Says it only makes a difference if I'm going to, be matzmid with respect to some other coin. But otherwise, since there was no change with respect to the metal content of the currency, it doesn't really make a difference. Now, I'll bring you one authority that has much greater weight, shall we say, in terms of all the other mekilim, and that is the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish says that if I know for a fact that this is in Siman Ayin Dalet Sifkot and Ches, if I know for a fact that because of a new valuation of the coins by the government, this is what's causing them to have either a greater value or a lower value, so then says the Chazon Ish that we would in fact reckon with that in terms of the amount that the person would be obligated to pay, that they would be obligated to pay more in such a case. That's what he says. This. Let me see if I can read it for you. I didn't copy it in the materials. Hold on. This is in Sifkat and Ches. This is a famous statement of the Chazon Ish. Ha'inin nishtanu inyan ha'mabeos v'mei rishonim kol sheyesh lo kesef osam mabeos v'melch lo yamakbi rak otzuas mabeos medinaso v'mabea hayashaveh erko b'kesef mishkalo. The mabeos were worth something. V'akshav kol mabeos einin shavas erkon. They're not worth anything anymore. They're not worth what their buying power is. Beinu rak shtari chov al osam memshala v'chayeves l'shalom api ha'chozer shebeinu ben yesam mamlachos. It simply stands for some buying power, but it doesn't have any value in its own right. And therefore, he says that it's all based on whatever the kingdom wants. So therefore he says, so therefore the change in value can apply to the coin just like anything else. There's no it could change in its values, etc., etc. Blah blah blah. Okay. So from the Chazon Ish, let me just find where he says explicitly. Here we go. So therefore he says, Lefikach gam b'malve al mabea, even in a case where there was a case of halva and the government changed the value, he says like this. It's a chashuv. He says that it would be considered as if it was pasalto amalchus. He says that the mali oseh chadosh, if let's say they would make a new dinar, he says this is the case. Right? Let's say every dinar was for 6 ma'in, and now the government says let's treat it like it's 5 ma'in. It's the same thing as Nifsala says the Chazon Ish. What difference does it make whether you're making a new coin or whether you're devaluating this coin? So therefore he says, he was talking about a case of Gezel. He says, even a case of Mavel that you would have to add the extra amount that the Malchus said that they were parceling. And the Chavis Das says that no, this is not a case of Pasalto, this is just a case of Huzol, and therefore it's considered like the coin is still extant, and it doesn't make a difference because it's Tiva, and Tiva, there is no such thing as Huzol. Udvar Svar Sal Tzarech Iyon. So the Chazon says, I think what he wrote is the Tzarech Iyon, and the Chazon Ish, you're asking, who sort of accepts this argument nowadays. So that would be the Chazon Ish, who says that if the government would devalue a coin vis-a-vis other coins in the same country, he wouldn't necessarily say this if it was devalued with respect to, let's say, the dollar, and it would still have the same buying power, within his own country. It would just be devalued within ultimately, it would change the value of things. But if it was, but he says certainly if you're changing the value vis-a-vis other coins in the country, so then of course you would have to pay a different amount going forward. So that's the Chazon Ish. So that's very, very important, because the Chazon Ish is saying that if you do have an official governmental proclamation that he's devaluing to a certain degree, so then he would go along. He's not going to go along with the Maharshdam when it's only a case of inflation. But if it's a case of devaluation, certainly one coin vis-a-vis another coin, so then the Chazon Ish says that in fact an extra amount would have to be paid. So I think that's a pretty significant authority. So if you pick up on the approach that linking to another coin that's also legal could be the explanation for Tosfos. So the Torah's Ribbis of Hishrik writes that this could be a built-in understanding of Hatzmada, even if you didn't actually do Hatzmada between the shekel and the dollar when you had runaway inflation, inflatia doheris. Like in the 1980s, as we mentioned, when the dollar was more yosef than the shekel, he could say that, of course, in this case, it was always understood that every single shekel loan was meant to be paid in regular dollars, just like the Shiltei Gibarim said that whenever people loan in matbeas nowadays, they're not looking just for the matbea, they're looking for the monetary value. The Igros Moshe writes this in Chelik Gimel Siman Lamed Zayin, which I have as the last source in the materials, but he wrote his tshuva in 1980. In 1980 was when inflation was still very bad. The Shevet Alevi in Chelik Vav Siman Reish Lamed Beis, Rav Shmuel Bosner, so he said something interesting. He said when you have rampant inflation, so then it's considered to be like it's implicit. If you don't have rampant inflation, so then it has to be explicit. But even then, he says, even when the shekel is more stable, because of the fact that the dollar is still strong, so based on the svara of the Nesivos HaMishpah, the Chavos Das, he says that since it really is still accepted as something which people view as a legal tender, as having a great authority, as currency in its own right, if you do Hatzmada, even when he wrote his tshuva, even nowadays, I'm not sure nowadays, but when he wrote his tshuva, at least it was after the times of rampant inflation, he said that implicit Hatzmada is not going to work. We're not going to apply it implicitly, but we will apply it when it happens explicitly. This is on page 12. He says that the shekel is stronger nowadays. And many rely on the shekel, not the dollar. Unless you did it explicitly, like the Nesivos HaMishpah writes, so then you wouldn't be allowed to rely upon Hatzmada. But he says, if you did it explicitly, so you would be allowed to rely upon Hatzmada. Rav Pinchas Ben, in his bris Pinchas, says nothing doing. Certainly, with respect to nowadays, he says that you go to Eretz Yisrael, a lot of people don't want to hear from dollars altogether. So he says, I don't know, it might also be a disagreement, it sounds like with the Shevet Alevi, but maybe he's saying that nowadays, when he's writing his sefer, the shekel is even stronger. It has been strong and steady for a much longer period of time, so he doesn't think that you'll be able to do it anymore. But there are other arguments in terms of using the dollar when one is making a loan in shkolim in Eretz Yisrael. You could say Rav Osner wrote another tshuva earlier. This was in Chelik Gimel. This is source 14, Chelik Gimel Siman Kuf Tes, in which he said that the dollar is arguably Yatsa Hashar. So what you do is psika, that you can make it, instead of it looks like a loan transaction, it's really a sale transaction. You're really buying dollars, and as long as there's Yatsa, the share of the dollars, he says there's always a share for dollars for currency every single day. Says even though it changes every single day, still every day you go to the marketplace, that there's a commodity exchange, there's a price exchange, there's a currency exchange, a currency exchange, you know how much the dollar is worth every single day, so he says that's considered to be Yatsa Shar. However, Moshe Sternbuch and others say, what are you talking about? The currency rates are changing not only every day, but every hour, or if not every single minute. So how could you call that to be a Yatsa Shar? So it's easier to say when the shekel-dollar ratio is much more stable, like nowadays. It's been 3.7 to $1 or 3.8 shkalim to $1 for a very long time. It's been in the same vicinity, I think, for a very long time. So maybe now you could say that it's more of a yotza ashar, but once I say that it's much more of a yotza ashar type of situation, so then I don't have to the same degree the argument that there's always an expectation that people are linking to dollars. So then the first argument becomes a shakier argument. Then there's the third argument. That you can always do whenever a person is you could do a psika transaction. A person can loan shkalim and want to have dollars in return. Again, he shouldn't say he's loaning. He could say I'm buying dollars if it's yeshlo. If the borrower who's taking in all of the shkalim has the dollar amount. In a psika case, a yeshlo can't be like sa'ah b'sa'ah. It has to be where it's not just $1 they have, but they have to have the full amount. So if there's a transaction in which Reuven is loaning 10,000 shkalim. 10,000 shkalim today, let's say, is worth $3,000, and he wants to get paid back in dollars, and Shimon has the $3,000. I'm sorry, Reuven is loaning Shimon. So Shimon has the $3,000 in his possession, so then, if he is, it's yeshlo, so then you could also rely upon this svara that he would be allowed to pay the $3,000. There's also a benefit in this, because if it's a yeshlo situation, you can also sell it at a discount. So if I would, let's say, pay let's say I pay the person who's giving the money 300, and let's say I'm going to lend, but really I'm buying, right? I'm the buyer. So I'm going to give 370 shkalim, and I want to get back $100. Okay, right now the rate on the marketplace is 3.8 shkalim to the dollar. So I can give the recipient 370 shkalim instead of 380 shkalim and still get back $100 as long as the person has the full $100 in his possession right now, because that's considered to be a yeshlo. So the advantage of relying upon yeshlo as opposed to yotza ashar is that I can actually even get money out of the deal. I can pay fewer shkalim and get back more dollars, which is greater than the rate, because I'm allowed to do that in a psika situation of a yeshlo type of a scenario, right? And then finally, you have the heter of Shlomo Zalman, who says that you can always do hatzmada. It doesn't matter whether the dollar is legal tender in Israel, it can buy you money or not. He says since the currency nowadays doesn't really have any intrinsic value, so therefore it's always considered to be a tiva, regardless of what type of currency it is. And the truth of the matter is that there is a ritva in Baba Metzia Daf Mem Daled that seems to say this explicitly. Again, there's a Rashba that says otherwise explicitly, but at least he has what to rely upon. And he says that nowadays you could even distinguish the Rashba because of the fact that the currency doesn't have any kind of intrinsic value. So maybe I could distinguish between a tiva situation. Nowadays, as opposed to yesteryear, where certain tiva would sometimes be viewed as payra. Of course, to say that...
Ready?
Yes?
Ready? How would Rav Wosner define hyperinflation? Is it like the rate or the volatility or like how it's viewed?
Well, let's look at his language. That's on page 12. Exafti miyazav legilyon sham dimkein lamanim mizakula ve'eretz yisrael shemabea yoredis ployim b'chol yom v'ayidei horgelu asokim lakshav akol neged $1. It has to reach the point in which it is going down at a rapid and accelerated rate. Every single day, there's a constant chaos on some level on the market. Where the devaluation is out of control, so that all of the merchants in the marketplace are calculating everything automatically based on their dollar value. That seems to be what he's saying. Okay, yeah. All right. Now, of course, the question of whether dollars are tiva or payra in Eretz Yisrael doesn't present a problem with loaning dollars for dollars, because then it becomes just a sa'ah b'sa'ah transaction, and all the borrower needs in his possession is just $1. As long as he has $1 in his possession, some poskim say coins are not good enough, but if he has $1 in his possession, that would certainly be good enough in Eretz Yisrael. Money in the bank probably is not good enough, but otherwise it's considered to be good enough in Eretz Yisrael. And Rav Elyashiv, quoted by the Nesiva Shalom, thinks that for sure, at least when dealing with between dollars and dollars intrinsically, as opposed to comparing one currency to another currency, where you can always say that the less used currency is payra compared to the one that's more used. So that would be hatzmada would be more of a problem, he would say. But dollars for dollars, he thinks that for these purposes, you can certainly rely upon dollars being tiva in Eretz Yisrael, even bisman hazeh. Again, it's Rav Elyashiv, so his bisman hazeh is obviously not 2025, but even if he was speaking 10, 15, 20 years ago, the situation wasn't so much different in terms of the stability of the shekel. So therefore, in terms of summarizing the Hatzmada l'dollar transaction nowadays in Eretz Yisrael, I make a few, parting points, which is, number one, as the Shevet Levi says, very difficult to say that there's an implicit Hatzmada to the dollar nowadays when you have a stable shekel. As you pointed out, that you don't really have the circumstances in place to say where it's understood that everything is going to be a Hatzmada to the dollar. Number two, if a person did Hatzmada, it's not entirely clear whether we would treat it as Tiva. That seems to be a machlokas poskim, although Rav Bosner was Mako, but the Bris Pinchas is very, very strong against relying upon this nowadays. But according to Rav Bosner, you do have a consideration of Yatza Ashar, or you have the consideration of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that all currency is considered to be tiva for these purposes. He has a tshuva in the Mincha Shlomo, and I didn't have this in the materials. It's Siman Chav Zayin, Sifkat, and Gimel, where he has this argument, at least if you're loaning dollars for dollars, and Siva Shalom quotes the same argument in the context of Hatzmada as well, says it very clearly. And number four, you could certainly do psika if yeshlo, and in a yeshlo situation, you have the advantage that you can even do things at a discount where you end up getting back more dollars that are worth even more than whatever the currency rate is of the shkalim that you originally gave. But what about the ksuva case? And I want to just finish with this. Yeah.
Number 3 was the Rosh coin?
Yeah. Okay. Now, in terms of the ksuva case, so the Nesiva Shalom speaks about a loan of 100,000 liros back in the day. And what happens when it comes time, it's not ksuva, but just a loan. He talks about how do we apply all these principles to a loan. He says that the government converted at one point in time, the way he writes it is that 1,000 liros were converted to 1 shekel, and then 1 shekel yashan was made to be like 10 agoros of a shekel chadash. I think that he meant it the other way around, because that's the other way around is kind of how the other post can present it, which is that a lira was basically 10 liras was made into 1 lira, and then 1 shekel, and then 1,000 shekel shkolim yeshanim were made into 1 shekel chadash. But either way, whatever the ratios are, basically the ratio of a lira to a shekel chadash is 1 in 10,000. So if you had a loan of 100,000 liros, so now that would be worth 10 shkolim chadashim. 10 shkalim chadashim is not the same market value of what you could have gotten at the time of the loan with 100,000 liras. You could have gotten a lot more in the marketplace. So he says, after this whole discussion, sort of looking at our simon and looking at all of these different these different shitos, he says that, look, one catch-all, a safety valve that you have in our simon is that if the dina de malchus dina is that you're going to view the new that you automatically have to pay a certain amount of shkalim for every single old loan of liros. You have to pay a cerern amount, so you follow dina de malchus. So that would be a safety valve. But he said there is no such dina de malchus. There's no dina de malchus that says that for a loan of 100,000 liros you're obligated to pay whatever was the market value at the time of the 100,000 liros. There's no such thing. So therefore he says that you can't really rely upon the marjdam when so many post-game disagreed, even though it's clear that the Mabeh itself lost value, but you're not going to be motzi mamon based on the marjdam. Even when Mordechai Bennett said, who had a similar svara when you were dealing with government evaluation, said, yeah, but I'm not going to rely on my svara to be motzi mamon. That was one of the criticisms actually that the Chassam Sofer had against actually the Minchas Yitzchak had with respect to relying upon the sheet of Mordechai Bennett for Rav Yalas. He said that if you look at Mordechai Bennett, he himself didn't hold that you could be motzi mamon based on his svara. He just thought that he had a good svara. So he says that you can't really rely upon that. And he says, and particularly, given that nobody would dream of doing the same in the reverse direction. Because if you're going to apply this type of a svara, you have to apply it both ways. And if it turns out that the Gushashim were actually Mordechai worth more, so then you would have to work with the assumption that everybody would be perfectly comfortable. Every Mabba would say, oh, well then of course pay me less. But nobody would ever dream of saying pay me less. So since nobody would ever dream of doing that in the opposite direction, he says very, very difficult to say that we are going to compel somebody to end up paying the whatever was the original market value of 100,000 liros. However, the Nesiva Shalom quotes Rabbi Yosef as saying that whenever I have a ribis drabanan, like a mecha situation or non-loan situation, so then he says, Mordechai, you could rely upon the svara of the Maharshtam Mishas Adchak. He says it. He says all kinds of interesting things. He finds the shver, but he says that there's another svara lahakil, and that is based on the fact that at least with the liros and shekalim chadashim in Eretz Yisrael, even though there's no official din of the malchusa of how you pay back these loans, there is on some level a din of the malchusa that the malchus itself changes the wages of the governmental workers and minimum wage calculations and things of that sort based on the devaluations that have taken place over time and based on whatever was the cost of living index, so that they do make adjustments to say, oh, we're going to end up paying more money. And therefore he says that in this type of a case, everybody would agree that maybe we should say that there is a din in the malchusa that we should adjust the various obligations. I assume by this he means non-loan obligations, but he has this very strong lashon yesh lahatzmid chovos lemeded. I don't think that he would mean that in a loan context, but he does use that lashon. So certainly, if we're dealing with the ksuvos of old, the old ksuvos, this has been the old practice of many Batei Din in Eretz Yisrael, where they have routinely made adjustments so that the amounts of these original ksuvos that are now worth 10,000 times less are adjusted to be somewhere in the ballpark of reasonable. I found two cases. There's a Bezdin and Spot case in 2014, a decision from Rav Uriel Laviv, of Chaim Bazak, of Yosef Yaguda, all big names in the current Rabbanut world in Eretz Yisrael. They say that the right of the Bezdin to make this type of adjustment, if nothing else works, so they throw in Makin V'Onchin Shlomin Adin. They throw in Simon base of Choshen Mishpat to say sometimes you got to do extraordinary judicial remedies. Why? Because it would be an avel to the women. We don't want the women protesting in the streets and refusing to marry the men if we wouldn't do hatzmada with respect to their old ksuvos. So in their case, the debt was 5 million shkalim yeshanim. That's what it said in the ksuva, 5 million shkalim yeshanim. And without hatzmada, the new debt would be a paltry 5,000 shkalim, okay? Less because it would be 1,000 times less. 1,000 times less than 5 million is 5,000, right? So it would be a paltry 5,000 shkalim, which is less than $2,000. So they note that both Rav Elyashiv and Rav Yosef routinely would do hatzmada on ksuvas. They would do a readjustment on the ksuvas, even though it wasn't explicit in the ksuvas. So he says, I spoke to people who knew both of them. I spoke to Rav Yosef's grandson, Rav Yosef Toledano, whoever authored this tshuva, maybe Rav Levi, I think whichever one authored the tshuva, said, I spoke to Rav Yosef Toledano, and I asked if his grandfather ever had a tshuva on this, because he would always do this. He would always make the adjustment. He was certainly capable of writing long tshuvas and everything. So he said, no, he didn't write a tshuva. He just said, it's pashut al pi svara, that the woman should get something substantial. That was basically what his grandfather told him. They also quote from Yitzchak Tzvi Oshinsky as citing from Rav Elyashiv that a Bezdin should always do what's mother with respect to ksuvas, but how they do it is at their discretion. Right, that was what Rav Elyashiv said. What?
Oshinsky himself says you shouldn't do hatzmada.
He quoted Rav Elyashiv.
He's misaking all the shitos with his hatzmada.
This is what he says. He quotes from Rav Elyashiv. This is what they said. This is a decision of Bezdin Sfat 2014. I can just tell you, they cite Yitzchak Tzvi Oshinsky is citing from Rav Elyashiv. You should do hatzmada, but use your discretion how you do it. Okay? I'm just telling you. I'm still telling you. That's what Rav Oshinsky. It could be he went against. So I can't tell you. Okay. Then he cites the Shevet Alevi that you always look at the Das, that you have to just like he had this automatic implicit hatzmada. So he says that there's an implicit hatzmada when it comes to ksuvas as well, because of the Yushami at the in Parakeh and ksuvas. It says that a husband always wants to give a substantial amount to his wife based on the fact of the Tovas Hana, being married to her, the Chibas Bia, and also having a happy wife. A happy wife makes a happy life. So you want her to be happy to know that she's going to get a big suva. So in their case, they turned the 5 million shkalim yeshanim into 99,000 shekel. That's what they decided would be a reasonable amount. Don't ask me how they got it because they didn't tell me. And then you have the case of Bezdin and Petach Tikva in 2015. Names I'm not as familiar with. Rav Yigal Lara, Rav Menachem Hagar, and Rav David Grayman. And they quote the Maharshtam And also the svara that you do hatzmada when it's clear that the changes are attributable to the coins having less buying power. And they quote, they bring the machlokas marashta machne Ephraim, and with respect to a devaluation by the malchus, they bring the machlokas between the chavos das and the chazon ish, and they said that nowadays, when the former coin has no value, they think that even the chavos das would agree with the chazon ish. So it's not just a question of there was a devaluation and now the old coin has less value. The old coin doesn't exist anymore. There are no livos. You can't get anything with livos, and there are no shkalim yeshanim. There's no such thing anymore. So therefore, he says that everybody would agree in such a case that you should do some sort of a hatzmada. Now,
even Rav Lerer says, "Im katuv b'ketuba shkalim, mishalim shkalim."
This is what he said. I'm just telling. Yeah.
Rav Lerer says you pay shkalim, whatever it says. If it says liros, you pay liros. That's what he says.
No, but
I have it in a different.
Okay, but this is a psak from 2015. He sat in the Bez and Petach Tikva 2015. That's what he wrote. I'm just telling you. Okay, you'll show me whether you have a different psak later in time. I'd be interested in seeing. Okay. I saw an article by Rav Yona Reiss, who gave a shiur here last year, and who's the author of Mishpat Ksuva, and he says you also have to take into consideration that if at the end of the day, when you're looking at the old amount that was written in the Ksuva, it's going to come out to some sort of amount which is less than the total amount of the minimal amount of Masayim Zuz that a woman is entitled to. He favors an interpretation of Ramosha that Masayim Zuz should always be like at least 1 year of support. So he says that you have to mark up the amount anyway because the woman's entitled. That's an interesting interpretation. Moshe did have language like that in his tshuva when he was asked about the value of a tshuva, the value of a ksuva. So Rav Eliyahu Shalom has more to say about this, and he says that, and this is a very interesting argument based on the lashon of the Chazon Ish in Siman Ayin Dalet Sif Hey, says that if the old coin doesn't exist anymore, so then you have to take the new coin and just transfer over, as you were saying, exactly the same amount of the old coin, and that should be basically the new amount that the person's going to be obligated to pay. So if it was 100,000 livos, so now they should have to pay 100,000 shkalim chadashim. It should be just the equivalent amount. And he bases this upon the lashon the Chazon Ish hilva mo love malve akshem din acher be shalava lo azlakan vein lo. He says ve'ein lo derech lemedina sheyatsa misham nosin lo mabea shemedina yoshim bakadin nifsal arishon v'choshin mabea shalkan kinegen mabea shalava. So he says that, hold on, I want to make sure I have the right site in the Chazon Ish, so just hold on 1 second. Here we go. That's what I read before. So nowadays they're not worth anything anymore, right? So therefore he says, so he says, if they don't exist anymore as a coin, you have to give the new matbea, right? So that would sound like you give the same amount of the new matbea. But he said something a line later, and I don't know why Rav Eliyahu Shalom didn't pay attention and didn't focus upon the next line. The next line he says, "B'matbea chodesh nifchas mipnei she'ein anashim nostim lo emun be'erach shaya lehem emun matbea rishon." If it has like a different value than the original matbea rishon, chashiv kinifchas ve'im hukru peri b'shvil zeh yesh lakshav es matbea chodesh k'matbea shenifchas. Then you have to view it like a matbea shenifchas v'tzarach lahosif l'malves ha'pachas, and then you would have to pay the difference in terms of the pachas. So if that's the case, I would imagine that it's true in the other direction as well. That if let's say that 100,000 livos would have bought you the equivalent of 20,000 shkalim chadashim, and 100,000 shkalim chadashim is going to be 5 times as much, I would think, based on the lashon of the Chazon Ish, that you would still only have to pay 20,000 shkalim chadashim, not 100,000 shkalim chadashim. So this notion that Rav Eliyahu Shalom says that you just mimic the exact same amount, I have to admit, I don't really understand it. Apparently others say that as well. If you're hanging your hat on the Chazon Ish, I don't think that's exactly what Chazon Ish said, and also just logically doesn't make any sense to me. You're not saying that these are meant to be equivalent currencies, stand for the equivalent amounts, so I have a hard time with that one. And he also says that in terms of the notion, otherwise, of doing, he says that you don't otherwise do an automatic hatzmada if the coins are still around. Because if the coins are still around, they just happen to be worth a lot less. So then he says it's much more difficult to rely upon the marashtam, because when the ksuba says sach hakol, that you say that the husband obligates himself this much, that much, and the sach hakol this, so the sach hakol, he says, turns everything into zakvan mimubeh. So it's zakvan mimubeh, then you can no longer rely upon all of these other, shitos that we don't want to rely upon when it's actual loan transactions like the marashtam. So he says that the only case in which he would really change things is if you have a coin that just doesn't exist to get today altogether. But I think that basically those are the cases that the Bati Din are dealing with. They're dealing with cases where the old coins, the liros, the shkalim, yeshanim, don't exist altogether, in which case it would make sense to have this type of a conversion. Okay, so last things that I wanted to just say is that one can always be makel on dolarim in America, even if the payment is in Eretz Yisrael, and shkalim b'shkalim in Eretz Yisrael, even if the payment is in Chutz La'aretz, since number one, it's a matbeah, number two, it's yatza hashar, and this is what the Torah's Rebbe says, and he says it's also true in the reverse cases. If you make a dolarim loan in Chutz La'aretz with the intention that it should be paid up in America, or you make a shekel b'shekel loan in America with the intention that it's going to be paid in Eretz Yisrael, because in the Makom Piron, it's tiva and it's fixed, so therefore any of those different variations are going to be okay. What about even if we say that if it's like an old loan where there's been inflation and now it's 10 years later, and to pay, we're not going to be mechayev the lover to pay. What if he wants to be mefatzeh? What if he wants to just appease the malva and pay some extra? So Shlomo Zalman Auerbach indicates that you can't do that if it's the time of payment, but if it's past the time of payment, so then you can always build in a knas for paying in Zman Me'uchar, and the Minchas Yitzchak also discusses this at the end of his tshuva, where he has a little bit of a more complicated discussion about it, but not for now. The last discussion in Siman Kuf Samachei is about why it is that when you have Dina de Malchus Dina, and the government says that you'll pay the new coin, even though it'll come out to be more money because it has more buying power, but the borrower has to pay it. So why is that chal? So there you have the important discussion based with the Ramban quoted by the Beis Yosef and the Sefer Trumos to say that it's based upon the fact that ribis bal korcho, even if that really would be ribis, and the government is requiring it, that it really would be an extra amount, it really would be a ribis problem. It's a ribis bal korcho is not really considered to be ribis, it would only be a gezel problem, and it's not considered to be gezel if it's dina de malchus dina, and we discussed that in the context of statutory interest, so we're not going to go into that right now. And the Chavez Das, who has a different approach, they're saying it's based on either Kollel schar kovel hefsod or hefker bez and hefker, might not necessarily hold by that svara, but the Chelkas Binyamin points out that the original sources, the Sefer Truma, seems to be more in accordance with the interpretation of the Ramban, that the real issue here is that it's not ribis because it's ribis abal korcho. In general, this is a very difficult and complicated sugya. The Chelkas Binyamin says that he's not, in his commentary to Siman Kuf Samachei, he always has a lot to say about everything, but he says, I'm not talking so much about the sugya because I have not been mevared the inyan sufficiently. So if even the Chelkas Binyamin says that, so how much more so, that I certainly feel that way. But nonetheless, I feel that even though there's a lot more to discuss and a lot more to be mevarer, maybe for another time, hopefully I've been able to bring some clarity to the subject. That would be my hope in terms of what I was looking to accomplish today. And I wish everybody a Chag Kosher v'Sameach. Okay.
I don't understand, but I'm only in the beginning of this video. I have to apologize if I'm missing something. But the Maharashtra lived in the 1500s.
Yeah.
Everyone in the 1500s said he was wrong. Everyone in the 1600s said he was wrong. Maharami bin Chaviv writes a tshuva, where he says the Maharashtra argued on him. Yeah. And even his own grandson, Bnei Shmuel, disagreed with him. He was named after Shmuel of Madna. Bnei Shmuel is named after Maharashtra. He said his grandfather's wrong. Everyone says Maharashtra is wrong. Safi Daravan the Kula. You have no Kilim Yotzi Malin from me. Why should I pay you extra money?
Okay.
So the fact that the Yeshiva wants to say maybe we should consider Maharashtra, also I'm not bothered. 300 years later, you want to start.
Also, they're using a different variation. Maharshtam was talking about even a case where it was just straight inflation, and there's more room to be meko when it's actually a government evaluation. That's what the Chazon Ish was saying.
And the Chazon Ish was only going to follow Maharshtam in the metro case. That's what he said, right? But the Maharshtam was
the Chazon Ish was prepared to be meko in the Haba case as well. He says so explicitly, but not based on Maharshtam, based on the fact that it's a government evaluation. So he says that. Also, he says the nature of currency changed from the days of the Maharshtam until the current times. Based on the Maharshtam, that the metal content of the coin still actually meant something.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two. So maybe I'm missing something. 300 years I haven't learned yet. Yeah. Number two. Even that section from Rav Lavi Paskin, you shouldn't do Hatzmada.
No, he said.
I have the summary here.
I'll take a look.
I have the summary. I was reading off of a summary. I haven't read it inside.
No, I read it inside. So inside he does say it.
Here, this based in an Ariel.
Hold on, no, this is a different best.
I know, but they quote everything here. Order HaMishpat.
Okay.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah.
Order HaMishpat is misakim everything.
Okay.
And we're not going to do it. Rav Shapiro also.
Very nice. Okay.
And then maskanato of Rav Shapiro's maskana was.
Yeah, that's not the.
But and that's also Chenichtav in Rav Levi's tshuva.
No.
Rav Levi's psak is also no.
No.
So they're misquoting.
No, it's not true.
Okay, fine. I gotta learn. I explain.
I mean, not according to my reading. I have the. I don't have it on me. I have it. I looked at it on the internet. I don't think I printed it out.
And also Rav Leir. Mitzayin Shakod Harav in Rav Leir. Medina Achon.
I don't know what to tell you. I'm just reading.
And the Beit Din HaGadol also, Rav Maimon Nahari and other, and Rav Amos and whatever, they said.
They all did it.
Eina mehat dvarim huvanim eileihem, lehefach it's machlokes shinuya, and it's only pitzuyim and pshara. It's not actually hatzmada.
No.
Okay.
No, that's not what they wrote. I don't know what they wrote. You see, that's what happens when you rely upon the summaries.
So I wasn't going to give the Chaburah of the summaries. I was collecting the information.
Okay.
But
so do me a favor, read the actual tshuvas, and then tell me if you have a different conclusion. I went to the tshuva. I summarized the tshuva, based on what I read, and that's what I saw from the tshuva.
I want to. I have to.
But it's confusing to me if they said it. So maybe there was I don't know.
Okay.
That's what they said. Now it could be that it was a combination. In the end, we call it Pitsuyim. I don't know.
And even what you were saying was that.
No, they were quoting though. They said that Rav Yashiv did it all the time, and Rav Avadia did it all the time.
Even that your lashon was a woman should have like Rav.
Yeah, right.
That's lav dafka using hatzmada v'ikaron. That's saying we have to.
It's saying based upon right. But the part that I found the most perplexing was Rav Eliyahu Bar Shalom, who just did like a direct transfer. That I didn't understand at all. I don't know if you saw that, but I didn't understand.
I didn't get there yet. I'm very much still in the matter.
I don't know. Look, it's a complicated Indian to tackle. I hope that I did okay.
I've been trying to learn through the Maharshal for a week now.
Was this clear the way I presented?
Yeah, it was clear. I feel annoyed with myself that at night when I start trying to work, this is the Chaburah I want to give in 2 weeks.
You're giving the same Chaburah?
I wanted to, and you did a different aspect of it anyway. But
okay, so you could do your aspect of it.
I don't think. This was excellent. I just wish I was further along so that I would be less bothered and more knowledgeable. But okay, I listen again anyway.
I am very confused about that summary. I'm very confused about that summary.
I collected all of those and I didn't learn them yet because I wanted to finish the actual content first and then I'll get to them. So we'll find out. Either way. So thank you, Kollel, for the Chaburah. It was great. How are you getting to the RIETS dinner?
I don't actually have plans.